what they saw as terrorism, the rebellion against the French, and how they used torture tactics against the Algerians to get the information out of them. And one of the things that may interest you about this film is that how it has been used. By both sides of the colonial divide, even in the present, because it has been used as a kind of revolutionary tract by the Black Panthers and the IRA. But post September 11th, it was also screened by the US State Department at the Pentagon. Yeah, sorry. Okay, so this, in that sense, it gives you a sense of, like I said, both the violence that was used by the French they wanted to go to any length, to any extent, to keep the colonized people in their place, to sort of subordinate them, etc. But also this guerrilla sort of war that was launched under the leadership of the FLN in Algeria for about 3 years, and Fanon was right in Algiers at the time, working as a psychiatrist in this hospital. And as I said, he treated patients on both sides of the colonial divide. And that is something that we will discuss next time when we look at some of the case studies and the conclusion. But okay, so today what I would like to talk about, we talked a lot about his, his definition of decolonization as a replacement of one species of men, that is the colonizers, by another species, the colonized. So it is the process. Decolonization, in his definition, is the process through which the thing colonized becomes a man through the process of liberation, such that a figure who relegated to a non-essential state becomes a kind of privileged actor, an object becomes a subject, and a thing recovers its humanity. That is what he sees as true decolonization. Now, the question that I want us to consider today is the whole question of decolonization and violence that we started talking about last time. How does he understand and, in a sense, affirm the violence of the colonized? So the first part is, how does he view, for example, the violence of the Algerian people against the French colonizers? Any sort of responses to that now that you've had a chance to read chapter 1? Consider this statement that he makes on page 23 that kind of sums up what he's trying to say, which I left you with last time. Colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence. Okay, so in a sense, what he's trying to suggest, therefore, is that the violence of the colonized peoples is in fact a reflection of the violence of the colonizers, that it is reciprocal and proportionate to the violence of the French or the British. There are several moments in the book where he talks about this, and let me take you to some of these passages on page 42, 44, 46, and 47, where you get a sense of how he sees the violence, the anti-colonial violence, as a product of the violence of the colonizers. So he says on page 42, second paragraph, but let us return to the single combat between colonized and the colonist. It is clearly and plainly an armed struggle. Indochina, Indonesia, and of course North Africa are historical examples. The existence of an armed struggle is indicative that the people are determined to put their faith only in violent methods. The very same people who had it constantly drummed into them that the only language they understood was that of force. And that is, of course, the classic sort of rhetoric of the colonizers. Oh, these natives, they can only be sort of put down by force, right? So it says that the very same people who had it constantly drummed into them that the only language they understood was that of force now decide to express themselves with force. In fact, the colonist has always shown them the path they should follow to liberation. And along the same lines, he continues on page 44, where in fact he goes to the extent of suggesting that violence on the part of the colonized people, anti-colonial violence, the resistance that they are launching in the form of, say, an armed struggle, is in fact a form of work or praxis. I'll read the passage, but in it says is that through which the colonized recognizes his or her humanity and that she or he is equal to the colonizer. On the one hand, the colonizer serves to deny any dream of liberty to the colonized, whereas the work of the colonized is to eliminate this fear by fighting the colonist or the colonizer to the death. And in effect to create new men. Right? So this is the passage in 44. He says, top of the page, for the colonized, this violence represents the absolute praxis. And if you skip about 10 lines down, he explains what praxis means. To work means to work towards the death of the colonist. And remember, the word colonist is used as a synonym for colonizer, the Europeans. Claiming responsibility for the violence also allows those members of the group who have strayed or have been outlawed to come back, to retake their place and be reintegrated. Violence can thus be understood to be the perfect mediation. The colonized man liberates himself in and through violence. So this is, colonization, any means should be used to achieve decolonization, including that of violence. And here he's elaborating on that statement and in fact suggesting that the colonized man who has been in a sense constructed or produced as an object or a thing or a subhuman is now sort of reconstructing his or her humanity and liberating himself in and through this revolutionary violence, right? And then on 46 and 47, if you have the book in front of you, that's why I'm giving you the page numbers. The end of 46, he says, the violence of the colonial. So this is a key passage which gives you a sense of how he sees this violence of the colonized people as a form of reciprocal counter violence. That it is in fact it has been produced. See, what you need to understand is at the time when he wrote this book, the Algerian struggle through a European and particularly French lens. The majority opinion was seeing it as a form of terrorism. This is, of course, before the age of suicide bombing and all of that. But this is seen as uncivilized, horrific violence, because what you would have seen in the movie is how Arab women are, in a sense, passing themselves off as French, removing their veils, right, joining the anti-colonial struggle, and one of them goes into the Air France building with a purse and leaves it over there. It has a bomb inside it. Another woman, she goes to a cafe which is frequented by French people, and she leaves a bomb there. And there's a moment in which you capture her sense of, these people are dancing, they're so carefree, and she looks at them, and you feel a sense of their humanity too, right? The colonizers' humanity. But then they leave the building, the Air France building, the cafe, and the bombs explode, and all these people die, right? So when, the majority or mainstream opinion in France was horrified by the events that were happening in Algeria, which they saw as their prized colonial possession, and they saw these as uncivilized acts, and, and they said, this must be quelled. We cannot lose Algeria at whatever cost. We just cannot afford to lose Algeria, and the rebellion must be quelled. What are these people? They're so uncivilized, not paying attention to their own forms of violence. And what the movie does very well is draw attention to that. And what Fanon is trying to do over here, when he says over here, the passage that I'm going to read, the violence of the colonial regime and the counter violence of the colonized balance each other and respond to each other in an extraordinary reciprocal homogeneity. The greater the number of metropolitan settlers, the more terrible the violence will be. That is the counter-violence. Violence among the colonized will spread in proportion to the violence exerted by the colonial regime. And then about 10 lines down, he says, once the colonized have opted for counter-violence, police reprisals automatically call for reprisals by the nationalist forces. Again, this is something that the movie depicts beautifully because the French army is called out to Algeria to quell this guerrilla war that has been launched by the FLN and in which a vast majority of people have joined in. There is this, even if I still find it next time and if we have another online class, I will try and show it to you online, just those clips, where this French Colonel Matthew, who's been called to quell the rebellion, he's asked by the French media that, the kind of methods you're using, torture, and, you're torturing these people, the kind of questions that have been raised more recently about prisoners in the Abu Ghraib prison, etc., right, post 9/11. The French colonel is asked, like, should you be using such inhumane methods against people, etc.? And he says, the question is not about the methods we are using. The question is whether you want France to stay on in Algeria or not. And if your answer is yes, then you must accept the methods. That we cannot have humane considerations at work over here, right? So, these are very familiar debates to us even today when people talk about torture. This is why this movie was screened at the Pentagon by the U.S. State Department in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And like I said, it's also been screened on the other hand by revolutionary organizations like the Black Panthers and the IRA because it also does a good job of balancing in some senses or giving a very sympathetic portrayal of the colonized people and their suffering and their exploitation, and particularly of the Algerians, to be more specific. So on page 47, he talks about reprisals. So there are police reprisals, then there are reprisals by the nationalist or anti-colonial forces. But, and this is one of you pointed this out last time, the outcome, however, is profoundly unequal. For machine gunning by planes or bombardments from naval vessels outweigh in horror and scope the response from the colonized. The most alienated of the colonized are once and for all demystified by this pendulum motion of terror and counter-terror. They see for themselves that any number of speeches on human equality cannot mask the absurdity whereby 7 Frenchmen killed or wounded in an ambush at the Sakamori Pass sparks the indignation of civilized consciousness. People are all talking about it, right? Look at these Frenchmen, they've been killed in this horrific way, etc. But on the other hand, the everyday deaths, the mutilations that are taking place, nobody takes notice of them. So he says, whereas the sacking of the Gurkur, Duaours, the Jera Dechera, and the massacre of the population behind the ambush count for nothing. Terror, counter-terror, violence, counter-violence. This is what observers bitterly report when describing the circle of hatred, which is so manifest and so tenacious in Algeria. So that gives you some sense again of the particular historical situation, the singularities of the historical situation in Algeria that Fanon was a first-hand witness to. And so much of what he says about decolonization and violence is the only means to achieve decolonization emerges from that context. So it's important to understand that and not just, we all would like to believe that, violence should not be the only means. Excuse me. But on the other hand, it's like I said, at the very least, one should have a sense of this context and where, what he's saying is emerging from. And like I said, the last chapter, the colonial violence and mental disorders, before the conclusion, really helps to complicate some of Fanon's own formulations on violence, right? So this is, and that's why he goes on to say that colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, and it is because it's not a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence, and what he means by that is what I said last time, that he believes that the situation or the status quo in the colonized countries is largely achieved by means of the naked and visible use of force, that is the military and police, etc. Unlike the situation in the mother countries, and therefore colonialism only gives in when confronted with greater violence. And that was certainly the case in Algeria, but it is not necessarily the case everywhere, and was not historically the case everywhere. We know in the Indian context itself, closer home, that there were a wide variety of anti-colonial struggles that eventually led to the ouster of the British from British India. And the most well-organized strand of the anti-colonial movement, of course, was led by Gandhi and by Nehru. But at the same time, one must not forget these other sort of local histories of anti-colonial struggle that took place in different pockets that often took a violent idiom. And here one might want to think about someone like Subhash Chandra Bose and Gandhi together, and their very different idioms and ways of fighting against the colonizer. Okay, and in fact, Fanon goes on to say, he goes on to affirm violence, not just to say that violence is the only means to achieve decolonization, but he goes on to sort of affirm this revolutionary violence for two more reasons, right? One, that he is suggesting that, violence it helps to this anti-colonial violence, serves to unify people at a collective level. It brings the future nation into existence since it is totalizing and national. Because it helps to mobilize people and create a sense of oneness and unity against the outsider, the foreigner, the colonizer, right? So in that sense, it creates a sense of solidarity against the oppressor, right? So he's affirming it for that reason, and I'll take you to that passage. And he also says that at the individual level, and to my mind, this might be one of his most problematic statements, but we will try and look at it, that it is a cleansing force that rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, because this is going back to that original statement, the thing colonized becomes a man through the process of liberation, right? And if you turn to page 51, this is where he seems to sanction violence more than anywhere else in this piece. He says on page 51, the second paragraph, the violence of the colonized, we have said, unifies the people. By its very structure, colonialism is separatist and regionalist, and we're all familiar with the divide and rule policy of the colonized. So this is what he's talking about. By its very structure, colonialism is separatist and regionalist. Colonialism is not merely content to note the existence of tribes, it reinforces and differentiates them. The colonial system nurtures the chieftainships and revives the old marabouts confraternities, and violence in its very practice is totalizing and national. That is to say, the violence of the colonized. As a result, it harbors in its depths the elimination of regionalism and tribalism, so it helps to create a sense of solidarity amongst diverse sections of the colonized people and brings the future nation into existence. That's the claim that's being made over here as he's sort of affirming this revolutionary violence. Secondly, and perhaps even more problematically, he says, at the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude. It emboldens them and restores their self-confidence, right? So this is, of course, the statement that I think is complicated by his own analysis of the haunting consequences of violence in the case studies that he presents in the last chapter on both sides of the colonial divide, including Algerian revolutionaries who engaged in violence, as well as Frenchmen who engaged in torture, also a form of violence against the colonized populace in Algeria. You really get a sense of how he uses the term vertigo and how it continues to haunt you, as we'll see next time. So you get a sense of, as I said, how violence is not a cleansing force. So I think that I think we can certainly question that claim, but that's the claim that's being made over here. So let me pause here for a minute and ask if there are any questions or thoughts that you want to share. The colonizer fabricates and continues to fabricate the colonized subject. That is to say, what was often referred to as the category of the native. Right? So what he's suggesting is, what does he mean by that? That the colonizer fabricates and continues to fabricate the colonized substance for the native. Any thoughts on that? Can you turn off your microphone if you're not talking? The idea of how the colonizer fabricates or produces the colonized subject does not mean that there were no people in the colonized space before colonization, but there were no natives within quotes in the colony before colonization. What does this mean? That is, the native, or the idea of the native, is an absolutely new category. Remember, the British would always refer to Indians as the natives, and today, of course, the term native is used interchangeably with indigenous people, etc. But it was also a very derogatory term at that point. So the native is an absolutely new category, in a sense, introduced by colonialism to assign colonized people to a different species, as we've been discussing, a kind of subhuman category that is created by the colonizer. So at various points, the native, the slave, is sort of a subhuman person, an animal, or a thing, whereas the European colonizer, it represents the full figure of the European, right? And or the full figure of the human. Sorry, the European colonizer represents the full figure of the human. And here you might want to recall Marlowe's famous statement, his description of the inhabitants of the Belgian Congo in Africa. And just pay attention to this, because it sums up exactly what Fanon was militating against, what we talked about last time, the use of zoological metaphors, etc. How non-white, non-European peoples were being produced and fabricated and constructed as subhumans, as animal-like, as a thing, right? So he says, Marlowe writes, it was unearthly, and the men were, that is the Africans, no, they were not inhuman. Well, that was the worst of it. The suspicion of their not being inhuman, it would come slowly to one. They howled and leaped and spun and made horrid faces, but what thrilled you was just the thought of their humanity, like yours, the thought of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar, ugly. And that single word ugly at the end of this passage that I've cited sums up precisely how the European colonizers viewed many non-white peoples. And of course, there were gradations and degrees. Some were seen, the native people who were produced as the native elite, the native bourgeoisie, were seen, as I said, kind of mediators between the brown or black masses who they sought to govern, and people who would be able to translate and keep the status quo in place. In effect, Macaulay's Minutemen, as Rushdie refers to them in The Moor's Last Sigh. All of us are kind of descendants of Macaulay's Minutemen in some ways as English students. But this idea of your remote kinship with this wild and passionate uproar. And here you might want to think how we ourselves reproduce such categories in our the way in which mainstream India, for example, has constructed and produced the various communities that are now subsumed under the category of the Adivasi. Right, that very similar kind of descriptions in, say, mainstream Hindi cinema that one often encounters. And therefore, when you read next semester, I think, or the one after that, when you read The Adivasi Will Not Dance, you will get a sense of the way in which a Santhal writer views mainstream Indians and their perceptions of the Santhals, not very different from what Fanon has to say over here. So that gives us a sense of how the colonizer fabricates and continues to fabricate the colonized subject, as I've been saying, this idea of the native as a different species, a subhuman category, a thing. And so decolonization then, as I said, is the process to which the thing, according to Fanon, his definition, so it does not just end with national liberation. It is, even though the term is used interchangeably with national liberation, independence, etc., but to him, true decolonization is the process by which the thing colonized becomes a man through the process of liberation. An object becomes a subject, and a thing something that has been relegated to subhuman status or inhuman status recovers his humanity. So, as we will discuss when we talk about his very succinct and eloquent conclusion, Fanon is asking us to move towards a new, more inclusive humanism, a post-colonial humanism, one could say, which is not exclusionary, and which does not create the European as the full figure of the human. So that is something that we'll discuss when we talk about his critique of European humanism. So far we've talked about how what does he have to say about decolonization and violence, and how he sees the violence of the colonized as a kind of a product of and a reflection of the violence of the colonizers, and he believes that it is the only means to achieve decolonization. And we've already tried to problematize that statement, and we will continue to do so in the next class or two. And then one of the questions that we've also talked about how he affirms violence because he sees it as a cleansing force at the level of the individual, because it's supposed to rid the colonized of their inferiority complex, and he also sees it as something that helps to bring the future nation into existence by creating a sense of solidarity, a sense of oneness against the foreigner, the colonizer, etc. Right? Now, the question that I want to also talk about is what does he have to say about the nationalist elite or the nationalist bourgeoisie amongst the colonized, and who are the true agents of decolonization according to him? They're certainly not the colonialist bourgeoisie or the political parties that often launch these sort of movements, who, according to him, are the true agents of decolonization, who are the wretched of the earth, in effect. So I talked a little bit about this last time, but I'd like to hear from some of you now. Colonies is the peasantry. They are the wretched of the earth of the title. They are the starving, poverty-stricken and suffering sort of masses under the brutal regime of the colonizer. And they represent the sort of downtrodden class that moves the motor of history, much like what Karl Marx said a century before about the working class in Europe, right? But the peasantry in colonized countries is not equivalent to the proletariat because they, according to Fanon, they exist at a level even below it, because they live in rural areas, right? To him, the only authentic revolutionary force that can defeat colonialism is formed when urban militants who are rejected by the colonized middle classes band together with the peasantry. So this is the claim he's making, that the wretched of the earth, this is the true revolutionary class, and they are the ones who have most to gain, and they are the ones who can whose violence has to be seized and channeled in the right direction, right? But then what is his critique of the urban nationalist political parties, for example? Did anyone sort of pick up on that? Something like the Congress Party. I think Muskan has a hand up. Both the urban nationalist parties as well as the intellectual and business elite, he says they cannot be the agents of this revolutionary change that he calls decolonization, because in effect they are invested in the continuity of the colonial system. They are mimic men who want to be part of the colonialist world, and they simply want to occupy the status of the colonizers without changing the system in any radical way. They believe, in fact, in compromise and accommodation. So, in effect, for him, according to him, the colonized bourgeoisie, that is the middle classes, the elite classes, and the global capitalist structure are co-dependent on each other for a continuation of the system. And more specifically, when it comes to these political parties that are leading, the more organized strands, etc. So this is what he says about them on page 21. he says, last paragraph, first and foremost, the political parties and the intellectual and business elite, they are strong in principles but abstain from issuing marching orders. That they may have a lot, they use a lot of rhetoric about human rights, the principle of self-determination, etc., but they are not true revolutionaries, is what he's saying. They are strong in principles but abstain from issuing marching orders. During the colonial period, the activities of these nationalist political parties are purely for electioneering purposes and amount to no more than a series of philosophical political discourses on the subject of the rights of peoples to self-determination, the human rights of dignity and freedom from hunger, and the countless declarations of the principle one man, one vote. But the nationalist political parties, he says, never insist on the need for confrontation precisely because their aim is not the radical overthrow of the system. They are pacifist and law-abiding partisans, in fact, of order. These political groups bluntly ask of the colonialist bourgeoisie what to them is essential: give us more power. And on the specific issue of violence, the elite are ambiguous, and this sums up what he says, or his critique of them. They are violent in their words and reformist in their actions. So they're not really looking for a complete change of the status quo. They are looking to appropriate, in effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, state power from the colonial state, and they want to take over. And there are so many novels set in the early years after independence. I think Rag Darbari, you've read that, right? Haven't you? If I remember correctly, the chronology of the syllabus now, you've read it?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, or Vikram Seth's a suitable, what's it? A suitable boy, right? That show, what happens, right? And how, in effect, and like I said, a very powerful story that depicts this is Mahashweta Devi's Daulati the Bountiful, which is the story of a Dalit woman who literally becomes a sex worker because she has no other means to survive, and it's a catalog of oppression that Mahashweta's narrator details for us. But anyone read that story? Do you know how it ends? Anyone know the story, Daulati? You all might know Draupadi, but I don't know if you know Daulati the Bountiful. It's been translated by Spivak in Imaginary Maps. Anyone? Okay, so in that story, it ends with this very graphic visual image of a schoolmaster in a village. He has drawn or etched out a map of India on the ground for Independence Day celebrations. And the morning, that morning when he comes over there, he sees the disease-ridden body of Daulati sprawled out on the map of India. And it becomes a kind of graphic comment on whose decolonization, whose independence. Right? That in effect, independence did not lead to true liberation or true decolonization for the vast majority of people in many colonized countries. I think that's what Spivak is trying to say through that story, right? So here and over here, what he says on page 23, he puts his faith in the peasantry. He says, page 23, the first big paragraph, the peasantry is systematically left out of most of the nationalist party's propaganda, but it is obvious that in colonial countries, only the peasantry is revolutionary. It has nothing to lose and everything to gain. So he's talking about the rural underclass, right? The underprivileged and starving peasant is the exploited, who very soon discovers that only violence pays. For him, there is no compromise, no possibility of concession. Colonization or decolonization, it is simply a power struggle. And, again, obviously Fanon is speaking, as I said, from the specificities of the Algerian situation. But I hope you are translating in a very responsible way some of the things that he's saying and thinking about how they might apply to our own post-independence context and how he might make you rethink certain kinds of ongoing struggles that are taking place in India, and that are their oppression and the violence that is often enacted on them in everyday ways to the extent that it becomes invisible to us, that we take it for granted, right? So that is something that we can sort of think about. And so he ends this paragraph. He says, the one that I already read, he says there was a pamphlet by the Front de la Libération Nationale, the FLN, which said that colonialism only loosens its hold when the knife is at its throat. No Algerian really thought these terms too violent. Colonialism is not a machine capable of thinking, a body endowed with reason. It is naked violence and only gives in when confronted with greater violence. So that is sort of why he seeks to, in a sense, why he affirms anti-colonial violence for a wide variety of reasons, as I've tried to explain over here thus far. Any questions or comments or thoughts at this select of Mahashweta's stories translated by Gayatri Spivak?
Yes, ma'am, heard of it. Yeah, so when you were discussing about it, it reminded us of the epic Silapatikaram, the story of Kannagi. We read the visual you were talking about. So that story too ended with a visual in the end and questioning part.
So okay, that's a good example for that. Thank you for bringing that to our attention. Others who want to add to that? A lot of things which actually go even further and beyond what Fanon is saying. And let me just, and he's speaking as a Frenchman who is expressing solidarity with the Algerian struggle, a Frenchman to the left. And if you look at page 44 of Sartre's preface, I'll just give you 2 or 3 pages that you can look at later. Page 44 and 48. Okay, and he's telling Europeans why you need to look at this book. Okay, and it gives you a sense of the relevance of Fanon's arguments and why he was seen as such a powerful voice. So he talks about he talks about the first generation of colonized people, and he says this early generation of intellectuals. This is Sartre speaking, and he says, then came another generation which shifted the question. Its writers and poets took enormous pains to explain to us that our values poorly match the reality of their lives and that they could neither reject them nor integrate them. Roughly, this meant you're making monsters out of us. Your humanism wants us to be universal, and your racist practices are differentiating us. We listen to them very nonchalantly. Then on the same page, last paragraph, I'm talking about page 44. And again, this is kind of the Roman numerals, so it's a bit difficult to, but just make a note. The last paragraph, this is what he says about Fanon. And he's quoting directly from Fanon's conclusion, which we will discuss next time. 1961, listen. Let us not lose time in useless laments and sickening mimicry. He's quoting from Fanon. Let us leave this Europe which never stops talking of man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners, at every corner of the world. For centuries, it has stifled virtually the whole of humanity in the name of a so-called spiritual adventure, the idea of the civilizing mission which we talked about. The tone is new, says Sartre. Who dares voice it? An African, a man from the third world, a former colonized subject. Europe, he adds, that is Fanon adds, has gained such a mad and reckless momentum that it is heading toward the brink from which we would be advised to remove ourselves. In other words, Europe is done for. A truth that is hard to swallow, but of which all of us are we not, fellow Europeans, convinced deep down? And see, the interesting thing about Sartre's preface is that it is addressed to French intellectuals, right? Many of whom were sort of dilly-dallying about expressing solidarity for, the Algerian cause or other anti-colonial causes against the French. And then here in the passage I'm going to read now, which is on page 48, he's telling Europeans why they need to read this book. And he's speaking directly to his peers. Second paragraph. Europeans, open this book, look inside. After taking a short walk in the night, you will see strangers gathered around a fire. Get closer and listen. They are discussing the fate reserved for your trading posts and for the mercenaries defending them. They might see you, but they will go on talking among themselves without even lowering their voices. Their indifference strikes home. Their fathers, this is the first generation of the creatures lying in the shadows. Your creatures were dead souls. You afforded them light. You were their sole interlocutor. You did not take the trouble to answer the zombies. The sons ignore you. So in that case, you say, let's throw this book out of the window. Why bother to read it since it's not meant for us? And like I said, he's talking to a French audience. For two reasons, he says, that you must read this book. First, because Fanon analyzes you for his brothers and demolishes for them the mechanism of our alienation. Take advantage of it to discover your true self as an object. So he's saying Europeans, Frenchmen in particular, you need to read this book because it will, in a sense, render yourself uncanny. Because you will discover yourself as an object. Our victims know us by their wounds and shackles. That is what makes their testimony irrefutable. They only need to know what we have done to them for us to realize what we have done to ourselves. Is this necessary? Yes, because Europe is doomed. But you will say once again, we live in the metropolis and we disapprove of extremes. He's saying people who live in Europe, not those who live in Algeria, will say, look, we don't approve of all these extreme actions that are being performed by the French army and the French police in Algiers, and we certainly don't approve of such instances of violence. But what Sartre goes on to tell them is that you are complicit in this violence, even though you're not there in the midst of the action, but by your silence, you are complicit in it. He says, it's true, you're not colonists. That is, you're not the settlers, but you're not much better. They were your pioneers. You sent them overseas. They made you rich. You warmed them up. If they shed too much blood, you would pretend to disown them. The same way a state maintains a mob of agitators, provocators, and spies abroad whom it disowns once they are caught. You who are so liberal, so humane, he says, who take the love of culture to the point of affectation, you pretend to forget that you have colonies where massacres are committed in your name. So you need to acknowledge, in a sense, your guilt, your complicity, Sartre is saying. And he's saying that I say to you, all is lost unless I, a European, am stealing my enemy's book and turning it into a way of healing Europe. Make the most of it. He's saying this is what Fanon's project is in this book. And then one last passage on page 51, which reiterates the argument about violence. And in fact, like I said, he is in effect going beyond Fanon in affirming revolutionary anti-colonial violence. And then he says, so 51, end of that page, he says, they only understand the language of violence, you were saying, that is the Algerian people. Of course, at first, the only violence they understand is the colonists, and then their own, reflecting back at us, like our reflection, bouncing at us from a mirror. So in effect, he is saying, and if you turn to 52 towards the end, he says, for it is not first of all their violence, it is ours on the rebound that grows and tears them apart. And the first reaction by these oppressed people is to repress this shameful anger that is morally condemned by them. And he says, read Fanon. You will see that in a time of helplessness, murderous rampage is the collective unconscious of the colonized. So Sartre takes Fanon's arguments about violence, etc., and goes even further. And he says, for example, in Algeria and elsewhere in other French colonies, Europeans are being massacred on sight. This is the age of the boomerang, the third stage of violence. It is flying right back at us. So this is, so in effect, he is a sort of, again, the idea of the reciprocity of the violence of the colonized is what Sartre is sort of trying to push forth in the preface over here. Okay, any questions or thoughts at this point, confusions, things